there wasn't a heck of a lot of money for young people, and those that were getting married were going to have to live with their parents. Nobody was rushing into it.
Mm-hmm.
The marriage rush started when the young men were being drafted and going off.
And it was while we were on Church Hill that I got married, which was like in 1943. But he got inducted in the Army on Monday and we got married on Tuesday. I don't say we had a wedding, I said we just got married because we didn't have time to do anything else. And then in a week's time, he was gone.
And there was a slogan, if you don't write, W-R-I-T-E, you are wrong. And the outgoing mail went to either fleet post offices, FPO or APO. Those were to the service people out of the country. The incoming mail from out of the country was photostated. It was called V, as in Victor, V-mail.
Mm-hmm.
And all the letters that came from abroad were reduced.
Say you got a letter from somebody. V-mail, which was a little piece of paper that was photographed somehow or another. All of this was very new.
Things just took weeks to get from one place to another. Even mail in the United States was difficult to get. You just waited and hoped when you got home from work it would be a letter or something.
They used to, of course, carry the troops on trains, and where we lived was right by the railroad track. And my sister and I, we would go out, of course, wave at the soldiers, and if we were a little older, they would throw their name and address out of the window, and we would pick it up and write to them.
Everybody had somebody to write to. I don't know particularly where we got them, but somebody would know somebody in the service, and they would say, write to so-and-so. And so you did.
It was very popular to write to people that you didn't even know if somebody gave you a name.
How did the war affect my life? Not very much. I remember rationing. That was a big thing. That was. I remember food stamps. I can't call them food stamps. I don't know what they were, but they were stamps for meat. I remember my uncle. I had an uncle in the cheese business in New York, and cheese and meat needed, maybe because they were both protein, they needed the same stamps, and he would send us tons of cheese.
You had to show a stamp and only get a certain amount of meat a week. And canned goods, you can only get a certain amount of canned goods. And you couldn't get coffee. You couldn't get coffee at all. And they had some kind of a coffee substitute called chicory. And you had to have a stamp to get sugar.
Rationing was, I remember it was hard to get sugar. It was hard to get good leather shoes. And those two things, and coffee. I don't drink a lot of coffee, but I know from the family it was. And even after he came home, there were shortages of lots of different foods. Like I said, sugar and butter was another thing that was hard to find. And we went to a a little grocery store, and if you were a regular customer, they had a habit of saving a few things back for you, and that's how you got along. And when we had the coupons during the war,
Some foods were rationed, and once again there was a stamp thing.
It was always during the war with things there were certain things that were rationed that you had to have a coupon or stamp to get, and you only got so much. And of course she had some friends that would bring her their coupons where she could get extra sugar and butter, and of course gas was rationed. And there again, my father, he was able to get more gas because he worked for the railroad, and it was essential that he got to work.
So there was gasoline rationing, and there were A, B, C, depending upon need, and the car owners were given stamps, and I'm not quite sure how many. A was the person who had the least amount. B was probably people. My aunt was a truant officer in the public school system, and I think she had a B sticker on the car. And then C was for someone like doctors and people involved with war work.
you had to have that little coupon in order to buy, even if they had it, you had to have the coupon to get it.
Yeah, rationing, you had coupons for sugar, for butter, for meat, for shoes. And shoes that I had were ballet slippers, because you couldn't get leather, you couldn't get rubber soles. It was hard to find a shoemaker who would fix shoes, so you just kind of slopped around in ballet shoes. Now, we ate the same, but a little bit more, because my father knew people who would give him meat, particularly flank steak. It was my first encounter with flank steak, and he would do oil for them and flank steak for us.
There's certain requirements. In the home, you had to have blackout curtains. We had air wardens. Some of the men that were not going off to war, even women were air wardens. And if they could see a glimmer of light from any window, they would come up and let you know that you have to be more careful. And when somebody rang your doorbell at night, you turned the light off when you answered the door so that the light would not be seen from the air. The upper half of the headlights on your automobile were painted black to reduce the glare of light.
He was an air raid warden, so anytime we had air raids or pseudo air raids, air raid practices, he would go out at night with his hard hat and traverse the neighborhood, and you had to have your windows, the curtains closed, no lights showing ever. I mean, this was not just during an air raid practice, it was the whole time. Well, in school, you had to go in the hall and cover your head and sit next to a locker that was sure to fall on you and kill you.
And then they had, we had like blackouts where you had to, have your lights off, and then they had airplane spotters. My sister, my older sister, she worked as an airplane spotter. Well, I think the airplane spotter was more or less a volunteer thing. I don't think there was any money involved in that.
In the barracks, and I could hear people yelling, screaming, and then we didn't have to go to work. I can remember we went to the beach. And we were just wondering what would happen, how quickly we could be back in civilian life.
And everybody went into New York and celebrated. Just being part of the crowd there. It was our only insurrection all through high school. We just poured out of the building and hopped a train into New York, where all the celebration was going on. It was neat. The whole of New York City was ecstatic. Absolutely wild.
My friends and some of my friends and I took the train to Times Square, and there were like 1 million people there in Times Square. And there's a famous photo of the sailor. He wasn't the only one kissing. Everybody was kissing everybody. They were so happy that the war was over.
When the war ended in Europe, I went to church. They had a service at the church, and it was a Methodist church not too far from where we lived. And I walked over there, and I remember going. When the war ended with Japan, I met some friends, and we went down on Broad Street, and we walked what seemed like from one end of Broad Street to the other, and the street was just packed with people and horns blowing and yelling and screaming and all that kind of stuff. It was a happy occasion.
I can remember I have in my scrapbook telegrams announcing that President Roosevelt had died. And then it seemed as though the end emerged rather quickly. Truman took over, and the next thing we knew, Japan had been bombed. We called it Hiroshima in those days. Now they pronounce it Hiroshima. And with Nagasaki, there was another bomb drop. And I can remember that suddenly it was over.